We're with John Rafanello, and John is the mastermind and creator of Wonder World. John, I'd like to have you start by talking about how you got into, thinking about how to transform the way that humanity is moving forward. And particularly, maybe you could start with talking about your understanding about the sort of family power structure in the world, the major families that are largely responsible for running things.
Well, my father was a bookie, Big Johnny Raff, one of the funnest characters you ever want to meet in your life. He would do the Jackie Gleason strut, and he was generous to a fault. And he told me when I was a kid that there were 7 families that ruled and controlled the finances of the world. And I said, yeah, sure, Pop. But over the years, I discovered that he was actually correct. And the fascinating thing was, of course, that the subject gets into immense complexity if you spend years studying it. But after, I guess, about 40, 50 years of studying the subject, I boiled it down to a line of incredible simplicity. Apparently, if the story goes back to Egypt, where there were a group of people who realized that if they controlled the finances of a country or the world, they would literally control the world, and that became their primary objective. And as the story goes, the Pharaoh in Egypt eventually found out what they were attempting to do and had most of them killed.
Terminated with extreme prejudice.
Terminated with extreme prejudice. The small group that remained or survived or escaped this termination formed what we now know as the first secret society, the Illuminati. And the concept was here, what they began to teach over the years, this evolved over the years, but they were eventually teaching their kids, their offspring, that they were the illuminated ones, that they had lived many lives and other people had not. And hence it was their duty and their right to rule the rest of the world for their own good, right? And in some senses, this is a very legitimate concept if you buy the premise that they were the illuminated ones and the rest were not. So that was the premise or the religious belief, if you will, that formulated through this secret society, and their prime objective became to control the finances of the world. Well, you can track the history, which is quite fascinating, but the grand prize in more modern times was the United States of America.
Why?
Well, because they were the most wealthy country in the world, for one thing. They were also the country that was producing the most goods and services for the average individual. They were creating a quality of life for the individual that was relatively not available in the rest of the world, although today much of the world has copied that. And there was an experiment of allowing the individuals to be free and go off and create using their own uniqueness to better themselves in the world, which resulted in all kinds of new goods and services. And hence the average individual lived better than the kings of old in terms of what they had and what they could do, right? They had televisions and cars and transportations and airplanes and couches and televisions and little video cameras and that you couldn't get anywhere else. So that was a prime objective. Now, one of the primary ways in which what became the banking cartel was an outgrowth of these secret societies, such as the Bilderberger Group, the Illuminati, the Trilateral Commission, the lesser societies like the Skull and Bones Society, these sorts of things. But basically, there's a lot of controversy around whether these conspiracy theories are correct or not. But it's obvious that there was a force of banking cartel controlling the finances of the world through Rothschild sent his sons into Germany and the United States and Japan with the purpose of creating a central bank which would eventually control all of the money. And one of the primary ways of gathering control of the money or gathering all of the money was to promote conflict among the nations and then finance the conflict.
On both sides.
On both sides. If you look at World War II as a more modern example, the Japanese, the Germans, the Russians, the Americans were all financed by the same banks, by the same banking cartel. They literally financed the war on all sides.
Also England?
Also England. Which gave them what? That put the country in tremendous debt to the banking cartel. And the basic plan for the country, we're going to use the United States as an example, was to have the national debt increase until it exceeded the gross national product of the nation. Right? So in other words, the debt was greater than the wealth of the country, and then they would foreclose. But of course, if they were to foreclose openly, you would have a tremendous revolution and tremendous upheaval. So the strategy was brilliant, tremendously brilliant. For instance, there are many factors to it, but the gold standard was removed. The silver standard. At one time in the United States, there were three currencies. The gold certificate, redeemable in actual gold, the silver certificate, redeemable in silver, and a United States note, which was redeemable in real goods and services. All of those were eroded and replaced by what we call the Federal Reserve note that we have in our pocket today. What they did was to, first of all, remove the ability of that piece of paper to be exchanged for real goods and services. That was the first thing, or one of the things in the plan. Then they rewrote the War Powers Act in the United States. There was a War Powers Act that was designed to shift all of the power into the executive division during times of war, so that the president didn't have to consult with the Congress and the Senate in order to take vital actions during an actual war.
So the president could simply do an executive order?
Yes, yes. That War Powers Act was rewritten in small print to include financial disasters of a sufficient magnitude. In other words, if there was a sufficient magnitude of a financial disaster within the country, the War Powers Act could be enacted, giving the president almost king-like absolute powers for a particular period of time. So they orchestrated that. They set the groundwork for that using the think tanks. They basically brought in brilliant minds, in order to accomplish this. Now, all of those were under the idea of making a better world, which in some senses the New Order was. They felt they were responsible for making sure that the world was okay, but they were doing it through very nasty means.
Well, certainly doing it through keeping control over the process to themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what occurred is, and there's, we could go on for hours with this, but the basic simplicity, I'm trying to get a simple line that goes from these guys wanted to control the finances of the world. They set the stage for being able to do so. And during the Roosevelt administration, the national debt exceeded the gross national product, and the stage was set for the banking cartel to foreclose on the loan.
Was that 33?
I don't know the exact date. I'm lousy with dates, but it is a matter of congressional record that the United States went into bankruptcy during the Roosevelt administration, and literally all of the assets of the country went into the hands of the banking cartel. Okay. Now, there's no real shake-up. This is not something that the American public was aware of, because that was also part of the brilliant plan. What they did was they created a corporation called the United States of America, all capital letters. They created a fictitious identity for every man, woman, and child on the earth. Instead of John Rafanello, large J, John, I forgot how to spell my name, John. It was capital, instead of capital J, small Hon, it became John, all capitals, Rafanello, all capitals, for every man, woman. This was a fictitious creation, a legal entity, a corporate entity, a contractual entity that was orchestrated into existence. It's a fictitious straw name. But through contractual law, what they did was they locked everyone into that system. When you got a driver's license or you got your social security card, it locked you into this artificially created construct.
Where is it defined that there is this artificial construct that's been set up? Is that set up in some documentation?
In the Uniform Commercial Code, which you can get the book, which defines the maritime law, which is actually the law which is going on in the courts. And you'll see the American flag, and you will see it with a gold trim on it. The gold trim is an indication of maritime law.
What does that mean?
That means like the captain in a ship has absolute dictatorial power, like a judge in a court. He is a king in that court and has the power to rule all by himself. He's essentially, in one sense, although, again, you don't put that out as an obvious thing, but he is a king.
Who's
He's
the
a
he?
dictator. Huh?
The he is the
judge.
The judge in
the
that
judge
court.
in a court. You go in a court, the judge makes the pronouncement.
Okay.
You know, he can weigh the evidence, but he essentially has the power to make the decision.
And this is encoded in maritime
It's in
law?
maritime, the captain of the ship has absolute power over the ship. Maritime is a ship law.
You're right.
And the captain has
And
the right to hang or have him walk the plank, anybody in the ship. He has absolute power.
But how is that applicable to the court system? I mean, is it that the court system assumed maritime law, or that within maritime law it said that this is now applicable in the U.S. court
Okay,
system?
what you have to realize is that when all of the assets of the country went into the hands of the banking cartel,
Yeah.
all of the assets went in. That
Including
includes
the
the courts, the police system, the military, the Navy, the Army. It's all, they own it all now. They own it. They literally own it.
And that receivership is codified where?
That's in the Unified Commercial Code. It's codified. It's codified in the congressional records that the United States went into bankruptcy at those particular times.
Okay.
But all of this is real fascinating, and I've studied it, and you can get pissed off, and you can do all of those sort of things, and that's where you fall into the trap. You know, a practical example is my wife and I were driving across up north one time, and the engine of our car blew up, and real long story short, we went to the mechanic, and he said it isn't worth repairing the car. It's going to cost more to repair it than it's worth. I just put $3,800 worth of parts in the car, and I said, well, let's at least take the parts out and sell them. He says, you can't. I said, why not? He says, it's not your car, and they're not your parts. What the hell are you talking about? Right? Well, again, this is a long detail of sorting out that the guy was actually right. You had to have a license to sell the car and a license to sell the parts. What happened when the car was made at Detroit, a certificate that represented the goods and services was given to the DMV. The DMV then issues you a pink slip, and you think a pink slip is the ownership of your car. Read the small print and go into the Unified Commercial Code, and you will find that it is permission to use their car. Right? Right? It's all, the ownership is artificial. Now the banking cartel would be stupid to put out the idea that you don't own anything, because that would break down the motivation and drive and spirit of the individual ownership.
Is that also true of houses?
Yes, it's true of every single asset in the United States.